A poor father bought an abandoned town for $800, and everyone laughed at him. But when he opened the old vault, the $250 million truth left everyone speechless. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The rain had not stopped for 2 days, drumming steadily on the dented roof of the old motel where Ethan Blake lived with his twins. Each drop seemed to echo the slow collapse of the life he once had. The wallpaper in their single room peeled away like old bark, and the floor sagged under the weight of too many unspoken worries. On the small table by the window lay a handful of coins, a few crumpled bills, and a pile of unopened job applications that would never be answered. The world had moved on without him. 10 years ago, Ethan had been a builder with a crew of his own, a man known for fixing what others had given up on. Then came the accident, the night that took his wife, Sarah, and turned him from a man with plans into a man merely trying to breathe. Since then, he had carried on as best he could, raising Liam and Lily alone, patching cars, building fences, taking any job that didn't ask too many questions. But the jobs had dried up. The town was shrinking, the work scarcer every month. The motel clerk, a man with nicotine-stained fingers, had begun to tap on his door twice a week, reminding him that sympathy didn't pay the rent. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his calloused hands. They used to build houses. Now they built excuses. Across the room, his children slept in a shared bed, their hair tangled, their cheeks smudged with dust. Liam always curled an arm protectively around his sister in his sleep, as if he feared she might disappear too. Ethan turned away from the sight, guilt clawing at his chest. He needed to find something, anything that could keep them together. That thought kept him awake long after the rain softened to a whisper. He spent his nights scrolling through local classifieds, auctions, abandoned property notices. Most were scams or hopeless ventures. Then one evening, when the motel's Wi-Fi flickered weakly, he saw something that made him stop. "Entire town for sale," the listing said. Copper Hope, Nevada. Population, 0. 37 buildings, 20 acres of land, 1 paved road. Minimum bid, $600. He clicked through the photographs, sun-bleached storefronts, a leaning church steeple, an old town square choked with weeds. Every sensible part of him said it was absurd. But as he looked at those empty streets, he imagined something else. A place that was theirs, where no landlord could evict them, where his children could play without fear of the world closing in. A place he could rebuild with his own hands. The next morning, he withdrew what was left of his savings and drove to the county courthouse for the auction. It was held in a cramped room that smelled of paper and stale coffee. There were only 5 other bidders, all older men who looked like they'd come for the amusement, not the investment. When the auctioneer announced the opening bid, they smirked. $600 for 20 acres of ghosts, one of them muttered. "That's $600 too much." Laughter rippled through the room. Ethan lifted his hand anyway. The men turned, eyeing him with the curiosity usually reserved for the unwell. When the gavel came down with a hollow crack, sealing the deal, someone in the back clapped ironically. "Congratulations," the auctioneer said. "You just bought yourself a graveyard." Ethan didn't answer. He signed the paperwork, took the iron ring of keys, and pocketed the deed. The county clerk, a tired-looking man in a frayed tie, glanced at him over his glasses. "Hope you know what you're doing," he said. His tone carried the quiet certainty that Ethan did not. "That place hasn't had a heartbeat in 50 years. Ethan met his gaze. "Maybe it's time it did again." "Channel." The clerk snorted but said nothing more. Outside, the air was sharp with the smell of wet asphalt. The twins waited in the cab of the pickup, watching through fogged glass as their father approached. Lily pressed her palms to the window, her breath leaving small circles of mist. "Did we get it, Dad?" she asked the moment he opened the door. Ethan forced a smile, the kind that came from somewhere deeper than hope. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We got it." The road out of town grew narrower with every mile. The highway turned to cracked pavement, then gravel, then a trail that wound through hills of red rock and sagebrush. They passed no cars, no signs of life, just endless sky and land that seemed forgotten even by time. The pickup's engine coughed and rattled, protesting the climb. Liam leaned forward between the seats. "What's it like there?" Ethan thought about the pictures. "Oh," he said, "but it's ours." The boy grinned, accepting that answer without doubt. They reached Copper Hope just as the sun sank behind the mountains, throwing long shadows across the valley. From the ridge, the town spread out below, like a relic trapped in amber rows of weathered wooden buildings lining a single main street. Their windows hollow, their paint flaking to reveal gray bones beneath. The old church steeple listed to one side, and a faded sign still clung to the general store. "Open for business." Ethan parked in front of it, cut the engine, and for a long moment they sat in silence. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling motor and the wind whispering through cracks in the storefronts. Lily spoke first. "It looks sad." Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "but sometimes sad places are just waiting for someone to listen." He climbed out and helped them down. The ground was firm but brittle underfoot, the air dry enough to sting his throat. They walked down the main street, peering into dusty windows. Inside the saloon, cobwebs hung like lace, and in the post office, hundreds of empty mail slots waited for letters that would never come. They made camp in the general store, spreading sleeping bags across the wooden floor. There was a small wood stove still intact, and Ethan managed to coax a fire to life with dry splinters from broken shelves. The twins huddled near the warmth, their faces glowing in the flickering light. "Do people still live here?" Liam asked. Ethan shook his head. "Not for a long time." He didn't mention the unease he felt, the silence too heavy, as if the town were holding its breath. Outside, the wind moved through the buildings with a sighing sound, the kind of sound that made him think of stories half told. Long after the children fell asleep, Ethan sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He wondered if he'd made a mistake. The money was gone, the future uncertain, and they were alone in a place the world had abandoned. But the idea of leaving didn't come. There was something about Copper Hope, its stillness, its endurance, that stirred something in him. It had been built by men who believed in the permanence of their work. Maybe he could believe again, too. At dawn, he stepped outside. The sky was pale gold, the kind of fragile light that makes even ruin look beautiful. The wind had died. From the ridge, the town looked less like a ghost and more like a promise waiting to be reclaimed. He walked slowly toward the courthouse at the end of the street, a squat brick building that had weathered the years better than most. Its doors were locked, but the key marked Town Hall fit perfectly. The hinges groaned as he pushed them open, and a rush of dust spilled into the light. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and rust. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers half open, spilling yellow documents onto the floor. He moved carefully, tracing the outlines of desks and chairs, the ghostly remnants of civic order. In the main office, he found a framed photograph fallen face down. When he lifted it, the glass cracked further, but the image beneath remained clear. A group of men and women standing proudly before the newly built town hall, the year 1911 painted across the bottom. Their faces were full of hope. He brushed the dust from their smiles, feeling an odd connection, as if they were waiting for him to finish what they started. Behind the mayor's desk was a door half hidden by a filing cabinet. He moved it aside, revealing a small staircase leading down into darkness. The steps creaked under his boots. At the bottom, the air grew colder. There was another door, metal this time, its surface blackened by age and smoke. In the dim light from his flashlight, Ethan saw the faint outline of letters etched into it. They read, "Copper Hope Reserve Fund, authorized access only." He ran his hand over the metal. It was cool, solid, real. The keyring in his pocket jingled softly. One key, larger and heavier than the rest, seemed to fit the shape of the lock. He hesitated, the weight of centuries pressing behind that door. Then he pocketed the key again. Not yet. When he climbed back into the sunlight, the twins were already awake, chasing each other across the dusty street. They waved when they saw him. Lily's laughter rang out, bright and defiant against the silence. For the first time in years, he smiled without forcing it. Maybe this wasn't a mistake after all. That evening, as the sun sank and the shadows lengthened across Copper Hope, Ethan sat outside the general store, watching the light fade over the rooftops. The wind shifted, carrying with it a scent of metal and something faintly burnt. He looked toward the courthouse, its windows glinting in the dying sun, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He told himself it was just nerves, the exhaustion of too much hope. But when he turned back to the door, he thought he saw a flicker of light from one of the courthouse windows. Quick, deliberate, like someone moving inside. He stepped closer, squinting through the gloom. The window was empty, the glass catching only his own reflection. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that Copper Hope wasn't as empty as it seemed. He glanced toward the courthouse once more, the last traces of sunlight glinting off its brick walls, and whispered under his breath, "What are you hiding?" Far down the street, something shifted. A shutter clattered against a wall, then fell still. The wind began to blow again, a soft, sighing sound that seemed to come from the ground itself. Ethan looked around at the deserted town, the place he'd bought for $600, the place no one wanted, and felt the first stirring of unease. Somewhere deep in the courthouse basement, beyond that blackened metal door, a secret waited. He didn't know it yet, but the night he turned that key would change not only his life, but the fate of Copper Hope itself. Morning arrived in Copper Hope, with a sky the color of worn metal. The sun rose reluctantly over the jagged ridges to the east, its first light catching on windows that had not seen dawn in 50 years. Ethan woke to the creak of wood expanding in the warmth, and the faint rustle of wind pushing dust through the cracks in the door. The air was cold enough to sting his lungs as he stepped outside, but there was something cleansing about it, something sharp that cut through the fog of exhaustion. The twins were already awake, sitting on the store's front steps, eating dry cereal from a box and whispering to each other as if they were afraid to disturb the silence. It was a silence unlike anything Ethan had ever known. Not the peaceful hush of wilderness, but a deeper quiet, heavy with the absence of everything that once had been alive here. No birds, no insects, no distant hum of traffic, only the faint sigh of wind over sand. He stood for a while studying the town in daylight. The main street stretched ahead, straight and narrow, flanked by weathered buildings that leaned into each other like tired old men. A rusted water tower rose behind them, its frame casting a long shadow that shifted as the sun climbed higher. The place looked dead, yet somehow unbroken, as though time had stopped but refused to rot it completely. He felt again the strange pull he'd felt the night before, an invitation and a warning all at once. "Can we explore?" Liam asked, already on his feet, eyes bright with adventure. "Stay where I can see you," Ethan said, though he doubted there was anything out here more dangerous than a loose floorboard. Lily tugged at his sleeve, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think there are ghosts?" Ethan smiled faintly. "If there are, they've had a long nap. Let's let them rest." She nodded, satisfied, and ran after her brother. Ethan turned back toward the courthouse at the end of the street. In daylight it looked less menacing, more dignified, a monument to a vanished optimism. He crossed the street, boots kicking up small clouds of dust, and tried to shake the feeling that someone or something was watching. The door was still ajar from the night before, the lock heavy and stiff but functional. He stepped inside, the light from the open doorway falling across the floor in golden stripes. The air smelled of mildew and rust, mixed with something faintly chemical that made his throat ache. The files and papers he'd seen last night looked different now, less mysterious, more fragile. He knelt and sifted through a pile of yellowed folders, careful not to tear them. They contained permits, tax receipts, correspondence from decades past. Most of the ink had faded to brown, but one document caught his eye. A letterhead from the Department of Mining and Resources, dated 1972. It mentioned a temporary suspension of operations pending safety inspection. A month later, there was another paper notice of closure. Then nothing. The town had gone silent. He left the courthouse with a strange weight in his chest. The wind had picked up, rattling the loose siding of the general store. Across the street, the hotel's porch sagged but still held its shape, its swinging sign clinging to a single rusted chain. Ethan made his way there, pushing open the door. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and rot. A staircase climbed into darkness, its steps warped but solid. Behind the counter lay a guest book, open to a page that read, June 1972. Dozens of names filled the lines, each one neat and deliberate. Beneath the last entry, someone had scrawled a word in haste. Fire. The letters were blackened at the edges as if written with something hot. He ran his fingers over them, feeling the grooves burned into the paper. Outside, the twins had made their way to what looked like a schoolhouse. The small bell still hung above the door, though rust had eaten away most of its shine. Lily stood in the doorway, her hair glowing gold in the sun. "It's pretty," she called. "There's even chalk on the board." Ethan followed them in. The desks were small, arranged in uneven rows, and on the blackboard someone had written, in fading white strokes, a half-solved equation, 6 + 9, 1. The space after the equal sign remained blank. Beneath it, another line, written in a different hand, read, "Class dismissed." It was eerie how ordinary it looked, as though the teacher and students had simply stepped outside and forgotten to come back. He spent the rest of the day cataloging what they had. Buildings mostly intact, wells dry but restorable, wiring corroded beyond use. His mind worked like a builder's again, estimating, planning, reconstructing. For every broken window, he saw potential. For every leaning wall, a challenge. But beneath that flicker of purpose was unease. Too many small things felt wrong. The way the dust settled evenly on some surfaces, but not others. The faint metallic scent in the air, like burnt copper. The way silence seemed to press against his eardrums. That evening, they gathered around a fire pit he'd built from old bricks behind the general store. The twins roasted canned sausages on sticks and laughed at their father's terrible jokes. The stars above Copper Hope were immense, sharp, almost close enough to touch. Ethan leaned back, staring at them, and for the first time in years felt something close to peace. Maybe this place could save them after all. The night air carried the scent of sagebrush and ash. He closed his eyes, listening to the crackle of firewood, until a sound broke through the quiet. At first he thought it was the wind again, but no, this was softer, rhythmic, almost deliberate. Footsteps, someone or something moving along the main street. Ethan stood, motioning for the twins to stay quiet. The sound stopped. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. He waited, straining to hear. Nothing, just the whisper of sand sliding along the road. Finally he exhaled, telling himself it was probably loose debris, maybe a stray animal. But even as he said it, he knew there were no animals here. The desert had taken them long ago. He stayed awake long after the children had crawled into their sleeping bags. The fire burned low, casting red light against the store's warped walls. He couldn't shake the feeling that something in this town was aware of them now. He remembered the metal door beneath the courthouse, the words etched into it, Copper Hope Reserve Fund, and the sudden flicker of light he'd seen the previous night. It could have been his imagination, a trick of fatigue and nerves. Yet deep down, he didn't believe that. In the morning, he decided to investigate further. He left the twins with a list of rules: stay near the store, don't enter buildings alone, and headed toward the courthouse again. The air was still, almost expectant. Inside, dust motes drifted like snow through the sunlight, streaming from cracked windows. He moved carefully through each room, taking mental notes of the layout. At the back, near the wall where he'd seen the photograph, something new caught his attention. The picture of the town founders was back on the wall, upright, though he was certain he had left it lying flat on the desk. He froze, staring at it. The glass had been wiped clean. The faces looked clearer now, sharper, and someone, somehow, had drawn a faint red circle around one of the figures. A man standing off to the side, his expression unreadable. Beneath it, in pencil, a word had been added. Mayor. Ethan backed away slowly, heart thudding. He didn't want to frighten himself with fantasies, but there was no denying what he saw. Someone had been here. Someone who wanted him to find something. He turned toward the staircase that led to the basement. The air grew colder as he descended. The beam of his flashlight quivered slightly in his shaking hand. The metal door waited at the bottom, as silent as before. He approached, running his fingers over the rough surface. His breath condensed in small clouds. He could hear the faint hum of his own heartbeat in the quiet. There, near the base of the door, he saw something new, fresh dust displaced, as though someone had knelt there recently. A faint print of a hand on the wall, the size too small to be his. He reached out to touch it, then stopped. The urge to open the door was strong, almost magnetic, but a deeper instinct told him not yet. He wasn't ready for whatever waited behind it. He climbed back up, shutting the courthouse door firmly behind him, and locked it. The twins were sitting outside when he returned, drawing in the dirt with sticks. Lily looked up. "You were gone a long time." Ethan forced a smile. "Just checking the buildings." Liam squinted toward the courthouse. "Did you find the light?" Ethan blinked. "What light?" "Last night," Liam said, matter of fact. "There was a light in the window. We both saw it." He said it without fear, as if such things were normal. Ethan didn't answer. He crouched between them, brushing the dust from their drawings. "We'll start fixing this place soon," he said, "but we'll stay close together, all right?" That night he couldn't sleep. The wind had died completely, leaving the air too still, too heavy. He sat by the dim glow of a lantern, staring out at the courthouse. The building stood dark and quiet, but he knew that somewhere inside, behind that scorched metal door, lay the reason this town had died, and perhaps the reason it had called him here. Just before dawn, as the first gray light touched the mountains, he thought he heard a sound from far-off metal shifting, like a bolt turning in its socket. The noise lasted only a moment, then vanished. Ethan stood, straining to listen, but the silence swallowed everything again. Somewhere deep beneath Copper Hope, something had moved. He didn't know it yet, but the town had begun to wake. The morning broke in pale silence, a thin veil of mist crawling over the sun-baked hills. Ethan woke with a jolt, his heart still echoing the faint metallic groan he thought he had heard before dawn. For a long moment he lay still, listening. The town was quiet again, as it always was, yet something in that quiet had changed. It no longer felt like emptiness, but expectation, as though Copper Hope itself were holding its breath. He rose, careful not to wake the twins, and stepped outside into the cold desert air. The wind was still, the horizon washed in gold, and the world looked almost peaceful. Almost. When Lily and Liam awoke, he had already brewed coffee over the small camp stove and lined up canned food for breakfast. They ate in companionable silence, the children's chatter bright but hushed, instinctively softened by the strange hush that surrounded the town. Liam asked about the courthouse again, curiosity gleaming in his eyes. "You said there was a door down there, right? Like a secret room?" Ethan smiled faintly, though his stomach nodded. "Yeah, something like that." "Maybe it's treasure," Lily said, brushing crumbs from her lap. "Or maybe it's where the ghosts keep their toys." Ethan laughed, but the sound felt hollow in his own ears. By midday, the sun burned high, and he decided to return to the courthouse. The building loomed larger in the light, its brick walls solid but weary, its windows reflecting the glare like blind eyes. He left the twins near the store with strict instructions to stay close. Inside, the air was cool, thick with the scent of rust and paper. Dust floated in shafts of sunlight, turning slowly like lazy snow. He made his way down the narrow hallway, every creak of the floor echoing through the empty chambers. When he reached the staircase to the basement, his pulse quickened. The steps groaned beneath his boots. At the bottom he paused, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The metal door waited for him, the same as before, yet the air here felt different, fresher, as if it had been disturbed recently. He crouched and ran his fingers along the floor. Fine tracks marred the dust, small but distinct, almost like the heel of a boot. He followed them to the base of the wall, where the faint outline of a handprint glimmered in the dim light. Someone had been here, or something. He unhooked the flashlight from his belt, the beam cutting through the shadows. The door's surface was scarred and blackened by smoke, but the engraved words stood out more clearly now. Copper Hope Reserve Fund, 1972. Beneath the main text, half hidden by rust, was another line he hadn't noticed before. It read, "Authorized access by Mayor L. Greenwood." Ethan whispered the name aloud, his breath forming a pale cloud in the chill air. Greenwood, the name matched the one circled in the photograph upstairs, the mayor whose face had been marked for him. He stood for a long moment, the key ring heavy in his hand. He could walk away, pretend he hadn't seen it, but that wasn't in his nature. The man who once built homes for others had always believed that every lock had a reason, and every reason a story. He searched the keys one by one until he found the largest one, brass and slightly warped. It fit the lock perfectly, but when he tried to turn it, the mechanism refused. Something else held it shut. He pressed his ear against the door and thought, just for an instant, that he heard the faint ticking of a machine beyond it, like the slow winding of an unseen clock. He climbed back upstairs, uneasy but determined. The main office still looked undisturbed, yet as he passed the mayor's desk, he noticed the floorboards beneath it had a hollow sound. He knelt, tracing the wood with his fingers, until one plank shifted slightly under pressure. His heartbeat quickened. Using a screwdriver from his belt, he pried it loose. Beneath was a narrow cavity, and inside it, a small dust-covered tin box. He lifted it carefully, brushing off the grime. The lid creaked open to reveal a collection of papers tied with string and a small brass cylinder sealed with wax. He carried them into the sunlight and sat on the courthouse steps to read. The papers were letters, each written in elegant cursive, each signed by L. Greenwood. They spoke of financial troubles, of a town struggling to survive as the copper mine closed. But near the end, the tone shifted. "The funds have arrived," one letter read, "federal assistance through the Recovery Act, designated for Copper Hope. I fear the townsfolk must not know until it is safely secured. There are men among us who would steal salvation itself." The next page mentioned the creation of a reserve vault beneath the courthouse, exactly where Ethan had been standing minutes earlier. The brass cylinder was harder to open, its seal brittle with age. Inside was a rolled blueprint of the courthouse basement. The lines were precise, the handwriting careful. A faint note scrawled in the corner read, "Emergency access route, tunnel to bank annex." Ethan's mind raced. There was more down there, a passage connecting the courthouse to the old bank across the street. He remembered the building, squat and solid, its steel bars still intact. If the vault beneath the courthouse connected to the bank, perhaps the town's secret had been larger than anyone imagined. He spent the rest of the afternoon mapping the blueprint onto the real layout. The distances matched perfectly. The tunnel, if it still existed, ran directly under Main Street. He returned to the basement, following the drawing's measurements, until he found a faint seam in the wall where concrete met brick. He tapped it lightly with his hammer. The sound rang hollow. Beneath his breath, he muttered, "There you are." He fetched his tools from the truck and spent hours chipping at the old mortar. The air grew thicker, the dust biting at his throat. At last, the final brick loosened, and a sliver of darkness opened behind it. A faint gust of air brushed his face, stale, but real. He widened the gap enough to squeeze through. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a narrow tunnel that sloped gently downward. The walls were supported by timber braces, dry but unrotted. The ground beneath was littered with small rocks and bits of metal. He moved carefully, testing each step. The tunnel ran straight for about 20 yards before ending in another door, smaller than the first but just as heavy. This one bore no markings. He tried the handle. It turned easily and the hinges creaked as the door opened inward. The light fell upon a room larger than he expected, lined with shelves and metal boxes. On the nearest shelf sat a ledger labeled Reserve Fund Transactions. He flipped it open, scanning the pages. The numbers were staggering, figures that would have been a fortune in the 1970s. Yet the last entries were crossed out violently, ink slashed over names and dates. Beside the ledger lay a stack of newspaper clippings glued to cardboard, all from June 1972. The headlines read, "Mayor Greenwood missing. Bank president dies suddenly. Copper Hope evacuated amidst fire." Ethan felt the temperature drop around him. He turned another page and found a photograph stapled inside, a picture of the bank's interior. 3 men standing proudly before a massive steel vault. Beneath it, in faded ink, Copper Hope Savings and Loan, Federal Reserve Depository. He closed the ledger, his hands trembling. The truth was beginning to take shape. Copper Hope hadn't just been another mining town. It had been a storage site, perhaps for government assets, money, or something even more valuable. Whatever had been placed here had drawn greed like blood draws flies, and when greed had come, it had burned the town down. A sound startled him, a faint metallic echo, as if a door had shut somewhere behind him. He froze, turning the flashlight toward the tunnel. Nothing. Only the soft drip of water from somewhere unseen. Yet he was certain he hadn't left the courthouse door open. Slowly he backed away, retracing his steps until the sliver of daylight appeared ahead. When he emerged from the hole, sweat and dust clinging to his skin, the sun was setting. The twins ran to him, their faces flushed with worry. "Where were you, Dad?" Lily asked, clutching his sleeve. "We saw someone," Liam said. "By the church. They were just standing there, looking at us, but when we waved, they went behind the wall." Ethan wiped his brow, trying to sound calm. Probably just the wind playing tricks. But his voice faltered. The church had no standing wall high enough to hide behind. He looked past them, toward the western end of town. The sky there was bleeding red, the church silhouette sharp against it. That night, after the children had fallen asleep, he returned to the courthouse door and locked it firmly. In his pocket, he still carried the mayor's letters, the blueprint, and a page torn from the ledger. He laid them out on the counter of the general store, reading each one again under the glow of the lantern. The words swam before his eyes, heavy with meaning and warning. At the bottom of the last page, the mayor had written a final line in desperate handwriting. "If this town falls, let the vault remain sealed. It holds both our sin and our salvation." Ethan sat back, his mind racing. He didn't yet understand what that meant, but he felt the weight of it pressing on him. Outside, the desert wind rose again, moaning through the empty streets. The firelight flickered, shadows stretching long across the walls. Somewhere out there, perhaps near the church, a figure might have been standing once more, watching the small circle of light that marked the only living souls in Copper Hope. And deep beneath the ground, beyond the tunnel he had uncovered, the old metal door waited sealed, patient, and humming faintly in the dark. The next morning came with the weight of unease pressing against the windows. A slow-moving haze rolled through the valley, dulling the sunrise into a pale smear of color. Ethan had barely slept. His thoughts kept circling back to the documents, to the tunnel beneath the courthouse, to the ledger that hinted at fortunes locked away and men who had died to keep them hidden. He could still smell the dust of the passageway in his lungs. His hands ached from gripping the flashlight too tightly. But more than anything, the look on his children's faces haunted him, their calm acceptance of his reassurances, even when he no longer believed them himself. He stood outside, coffee steaming in the chill air, scanning the horizon. The stillness was so complete that when an engine's rumble broke it, the sound struck like thunder. It came from beyond the ridge, faint at first, then rising. He turned sharply toward the road that led into Copper Hope. Within minutes, 3 trucks appeared, kicking up dust as they descended the winding path. The lead vehicle was a black pickup, spotless and new out of place among the ruins. Ethan felt his shoulders tighten. Visitors in a town forgotten for 50 years never came with good intentions. The trucks rolled to a stop in front of the courthouse. Doors slammed in succession, the echo bouncing between the buildings. 6 men stepped out, the kind of men who carried themselves like they were used to being obeyed. The leader was tall and broad, wearing a weathered leather jacket and mirrored sunglasses that hid his eyes. His face was carved with the kind of sternness that only comes from entitlement. The others fanned out behind him, men built like laborers but moving with military precision. One of them rested a hand on his hip where a holster bulged under his coat. "You must be Blake," the leader said, his voice deep and calm. "The new owner of Copper Hope." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's right. You are?" The man smiled, a gesture without warmth. "Tom Grayson. I represent the Southland Mineral Company. Our firm once held property rights to this land. We've been trying to locate certain assets left behind." He removed his sunglasses and his pale eyes fixed on Ethan with calculated politeness. "You've been doing a lot of digging lately. We'd like to make sure nothing of ours is being disturbed." Ethan felt the heat rising in his chest. "I bought this town legally," he said. "Every acre. Whatever's buried here belongs to Copper Hope now." Grayson's smile didn't fade. "I'm sure you believe that. But legal ownership and moral ownership aren't always the same thing, Mr. Blake. Sometimes things belong to history, not to people." His men chuckled quietly. The sound was low but full of threat. Liam and Lily had appeared in the doorway of the store. watching nervously. Ethan stepped slightly to the side, placing himself between them and the strangers. "You need to leave," he said, his tone steady. "There's nothing for you here." Grayson's gaze drifted toward the children, then back to Ethan. "See? That's where I think you're wrong." He took a few steps closer, lowering his voice. "You found something down there, under the courthouse. I know it, and you know it. So let's make this simple. You give us what we came for, and we forget this conversation ever happened." Ethan met his stare and said nothing. The silence stretched until the air felt like glass ready to shatter. Finally, Grayson sighed, slid his sunglasses back on, and turned toward his truck. "You've got till the end of the week to reconsider," he said, his voice casual again. "After that, we won't be asking so nicely." The engine started and the trucks rolled out, leaving only dust and the fading echo of their threat. When the sound of the engines vanished, Lily ran to her father, her voice trembling. "Who were they, Dad?" Ethan rested a hand on her shoulder, forcing calm into his voice. "Just people who don't understand this place," he said. But inside he knew exactly who they were. Scavengers dressed as businessmen, the kind of men who had buried copper hope once before and would do it again if it meant turning a profit. That night he sat by the dying fire, turning the mayor's letters over in his hands. The ink seemed to darken in the flickering light, the words whispering a truth he was only beginning to grasp. The mayor had hidden the fund not out of greed, but out of fear of people like Grayson, men who saw salvation as a resource to be mined. Ethan thought of the blueprint, the tunnel, the metal door sealed for half a century. He realized now why Greenwood had written that final plea. The vault held more than money. It held the town's curse, the reason its name had been erased from maps. The following day, Ethan loaded his truck with the papers, maps, and the pieces of the blueprint, then drove to the county seat 2 hours away. The road was rough, cutting through desert and scrub. He rehearsed his words the whole way, wondering whether anyone would even listen. But when he reached the county administration office and stepped inside, dusty and sunburned, something in his conviction made the clerk behind the counter take him seriously. Within an hour, he was speaking to a deputy district attorney, laying out the documents in front of him. The official studied the faded letters carefully, his brow furrowing as he read. "You're saying this vault contains federal property? Recovery funds from the 1970s? "That's what the paperwork shows," Ethan said. "And people know about it. They're coming for it." The man leaned back in his chair, whistling softly. "If this checks out, it's not just property, it's evidence. Historical, possibly criminal. We'll have to verify everything, but..." He looked up, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "You said people came to threaten you?" "They said they represent a mining company. I think they're after whatever's in that vault." By the time Ethan left the office, the wheels of bureaucracy were already turning. Calls were being made, files pulled from archives long thought destroyed. For the first time since coming to Copper Hope, he felt the weight of responsibility shift slightly from his shoulders. Yet as he drove back into the mountains, the sun dropping behind the hills, he couldn't shake the sense that Grayson wouldn't wait for paperwork. He reached the edge of town as dusk fell. The twins ran to meet him, relief on their faces. "Everything's fine," he told them, though his voice was tight. They ate a quiet dinner by lantern light, and when the children finally fell asleep, Ethan walked alone toward the courthouse. The front door stood closed, just as he had left it. But when he reached for the handle, he froze. A single nail had been driven into the wood, holding a scrap of paper. He pulled it free and unfolded it. The message was written in bold, jagged letters, carved more than written. "You're digging up graves." He looked around, the darkness pressing in. The main street was empty, the windows black, but somewhere nearby a floorboard creaked, followed by the faint sound of gravel shifting. He turned toward the noise, his pulse hammering. For a moment he thought he saw movement near the church, just a shadow slipping between broken walls, but then it was gone. The silence closed again, deeper than before. Ethan folded the note and tucked it into his jacket. He didn't need more warnings. The men from the past had returned, and the ghosts of Copper Hope had chosen their messenger well. When he reached the general store, the twins were stirring in their sleep, murmuring softly. He sat beside them until the tremor in his hands faded. Tomorrow he would not hide. Tomorrow he would make the truth public, no matter what it cost. But as he closed his eyes, he could still see that scrap of paper nailed to the courthouse door, and the words burned into his mind. The next morning, he woke to find the courthouse door wide open. The lock was broken, the hinges twisted. Inside, everything was undisturbed except for one thing: the mayor's portrait, which had fallen from the wall. The glass was shattered, and across the surface of the photograph, in the dust of 50 years, someone had traced a single word with their finger: run. Ethan stood staring at it, the morning light cutting through the broken window. He could taste the dry metallic tang of fear in his mouth. The men had made their move, but so would he. Before this was over, Copper Hope's story would belong to no corporation, no thieves, no ghosts, only to those willing to rebuild it from ashes. He closed the door behind him, locking it one last time. The sound echoed through the still air, sharp and final, as though marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled over the desert hills, and Ethan knew that the fight for Copper Hope had truly begun. The storm that had been brewing over the desert finally broke that night, a long, low thunder rolling across the valley like the voice of something ancient stirring. Rain came in sheets, washing away months of dust, hammering on rooftops, drenching the streets of Copper Hope until the town looked almost alive again. Ethan sat by the window of the general store, the twins asleep nearby, and watched the rain trace shimmering rivers down the glass. For the first time since he'd bought the place, the air smelled clean. He couldn't help wondering if the land itself was trying to start over. The morning after the storm was bright and cold. The sky had been scrubbed into a flawless blue, the kind that made every shadow look sharper. Ethan stood on the porch, surveying the wreckage. The rain had torn down loose shingles, toppled a few fences, and scattered debris across Main Street. But it had also done something else. It had revealed outlines in the mud, faint rectangular shapes where foundations lay buried. It was as if the town's bones had risen to the surface, reminding him that beneath the decay was a map of what once had been. He felt a surge of determination. Copper Hope wasn't dead. It was waiting. The confrontation with Grayson's men still lingered in his thoughts. He had expected them to return in the storm's aftermath, to finish what they had started. But the valley remained empty, silent except for the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. Perhaps the storm had driven them off, or perhaps they were simply waiting for a calmer moment to strike. Ethan didn't intend to give them one. The day after the storm, 2 county trucks appeared at the edge of town, their tires hissing through wet gravel. Men stepped out in clean shirts and official hats, carrying clipboards and cameras. They introduced themselves as investigators from the Federal Archives Division. The deputy district attorney had wasted no time. Ethan led them to the courthouse. They photographed everything: the letters, the tunnel, the vault entrance. When one of them found the broken lock on the courthouse door, he frowned. "Someone else has been here," he said. "Recently." Ethan didn't deny it. "They'll be back if they think they can get anything out of it." The agent nodded grimly. "We'll make sure they don't." Within a week, Copper Hope was no longer forgotten. The discovery of lost federal assets spread through the county like wildfire. Reporters came, historians came, government officials came. Ethan hated the attention, but he also knew it was necessary. The investigation confirmed everything. Copper Hope had been a wartime reserve site, one of several remote towns chosen to hold emergency gold and silver deposits. The records showed that the shipment intended for the town had vanished in 1972, along with the 3 officials responsible for its safekeeping. For half a century, no one had known why. Now, with Ethan's discovery, the mystery was unraveling. When the vault was finally opened under federal supervision, the air that rushed out smelled of dust and cold metal. Inside, the investigators found not only the silver reserve, but also the skeletons of the men who had sealed themselves inside, exactly as the old letters had described. One of them, identified from a name tag, was Mayor Leonard Greenwood. In his skeletal hand, they found a folded page from his journal, preserved between 2 slabs of steel. The final line read, "We chose to die with what we could not carry." The words echoed in Ethan's head long after the vault was resealed. The news reached the state capitol within days. For the first time in generations, Copper Hope appeared on maps again, marked as a historical site. The government awarded Ethan an official finder's compensation and extended preservation funding for the restoration of the town. He could barely process it. The check that arrived by courier could have bought him a house anywhere else, a fresh start, a new life. But as he looked around at the crooked buildings, the cracked windows, and the wide desert beyond, he realized he didn't want a new life. He wanted this chance to finish what the people of Copper Hope had started long before greed destroyed them. Work began that spring. Contractors arrived with equipment, engineers mapped out water lines, and local volunteers from nearby towns offered to help. The general store became their base of operations, its front porch covered with blueprints and supply lists. Ethan worked alongside them every day, his hands raw from labor but his spirit lighter than it had been in years. Liam and Lily helped too, hauling scraps, sweeping dust, learning the names of tools their father had once used to build other people's dreams. Now they were building their own. By midsummer, the change was undeniable. The streets were cleared, the roofs repaired, and the first lights flickered to life after 50 silent years. The courthouse was reinforced and turned into a museum. The old hotel became a community hall. The church, once a blackened skeleton, was rebuilt with wood donated from nearby ranches. When the solar lamps came on each evening, their soft glow washed the town in a warmth that felt almost holy. People began to visit, curious travelers, historians, families seeking a piece of the past. For every stranger who stepped onto its dusty road, Copper Hope offered the same quiet message. Redemption is not found, it is built. Ethan's story spread faster than he wanted. Newspapers called him the man who bought a town and gave it back its soul. He cringed at the phrase but accepted it for what it was, proof that honesty could still mean something. When reporters asked why he hadn't kept the treasure for himself, he always answered the same way. Because it wasn't mine. It belonged to everyone who believed in second chances. One evening, as the sun bled out behind the mountains, a car pulled into town, a small silver sedan that looked like it had come a long way. An elderly woman stepped out, her hair the color of snow, her back straight despite the years. She walked slowly toward Ethan, who was standing near the courthouse steps. "Mr. Blake," she said, her voice soft but clear. "My name is Eleanor Greenwood. My grandfather was Leonard Greenwood, the mayor." For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. "You should see what your grandfather helped build," he finally said. "His letters saved this place." She smiled faintly. "He saved more than the town. He saved our family's name." She reached into her purse and drew out a small object wrapped in cloth. When she unfolded it, Ethan saw a brass key, the same type as the one he had used to open the vault. "This was found in his home after the evacuation," she said. "I think he meant for it to come back here someday." She placed it in his hand, closing his fingers around it. "Keep it safe. Some doors should never be locked again." As the months passed, the town continued to grow. Families from neighboring counties moved in, opening small shops and cafes. A teacher volunteered to reopen the schoolhouse. On weekends, children's laughter filled the air again. Liam and Lily made friends, their games echoing between the buildings that had once stood silent for half a century. Ethan often watched them from the steps of the courthouse, feeling something he hadn't felt since Sarah's death piece. Winter came early that year. On the night before Christmas, the town gathered in the square, now lit by strings of white lights looping from building to building. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke. Someone had set up a piano near the fountain, and music drifted through the cold air. Ethan stood among them, the twins at his sides, their faces bright with wonder. The restored church bell rang for the first time since 1972, its deep, steady tone carrying through the valley. People cheered, some cried. It felt as though the town itself were breathing again. Later, after the celebration ended and the square emptied, Ethan walked alone to the courthouse. He stepped inside, past the displays of photographs and relics, until he reached the vault room. The massive steel door stood open now, gleaming under soft light. Inside, the shelves were empty except for a few artifacts and a plaque commemorating the 3 men who had given their lives to protect what they couldn't bear to lose. On the wall hung the mayor's final words, engraved in brass, "We chose to die with what we could not carry, so that others might live with what we could not keep. Ethan stood there for a long time, his reflection merging with the words. He realized that what they had left behind wasn't just wealth, it was a warning. Greed had destroyed their town once, but courage had rebuilt it. He turned off the light and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the stars bright enough to paint shadows on the ground. From the edge of town came a faint glow, a lantern bobbing near the rebuilt church. It was probably one of the volunteers finishing late work, but for a moment it looked like something older, a spirit wandering through the place it once called home. Ethan smiled, choosing not to investigate. Some mysteries, he thought, didn't need solving. They just needed peace. He walked back toward the house where Liam and Lily waited. Warm light spilled from the windows, laughter drifting out to meet him. Copper Hope had been a grave when he found it, but now it was alive, reborn through the stubborn will of a man and his children who refused to give up. He paused at the door, looking back at the town that had cost him everything and given him more in return. The wind swept softly through the streets, carrying the scent of cedar and rain. Somewhere a bell chimed once, low and distant, and then all was still. Ethan whispered into the night, "You're home now." The town stood quiet, its lights flickering against the dark hills, alive at last. And for the first time in 50 years, Copper Hope slept, not in silence, but in peace. If you believe some places and some people deserve a second chance, hit that subscribe button right now. Don't miss the next story that will change how you see everything. And if this one moved you, share it. Someone out there needs to hear it today.